Hi, everyone. Welcome to topic one. My name is Tony Capra, and I'm an associate professor in the Bakar Computational Health Sciences Institute and chief of the Division of Bioinformatics in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And my lab builds algorithms that integrate genetic data with clinical data to attempt to better explain and understand the mechanisms of disease. And in this research, I've really seen how important and powerful it is to have explainable and testable predictions. For example, telling a patient that they have a genetic variant that is pathogenic doesn't really do a lot. But telling them that they have a variant that we predict disrupts an ion channel on their cells that changes how it lets different molecules through those cells and how that leads to the disease. Well, that's a testable prediction. That's something that we can actually act upon and move forward with. And so I'm really excited for this first topic that focuses on how we can advance explainability and how we can use it when it's necessary and what it even means. And so we've put together a panel here of experts with different backgrounds and perspectives on this question. But most importantly, we've got you here in the audience, and that's what we really want to hear from. That's what we want to understand. What are your perspectives on what it means for an algorithm to be explainable? And then we'll see how our experts respond to that. So let me start by introducing our panel that will be here. We'll have 3 speakers. Each will get about 10 minutes where they'll talk about their perspectives in this question. And then we'll open it up for about half an hour to questions from all of you. And that includes everyone on Zoom, of course, too. So please don't be shy. So first up, we've got Jianying from IBM. She's the Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences Research and the Global Science Leader, AI for Healthcare at IBM Research New York 10 Heights. She's also an adjunct professor at the School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And she conducts and leads research in machine learning, data mining, statistical pattern recognition, and signal processing with applications in many areas, including healthcare analytics, medical informatics, business analytics, and multimedia content analysis. And so then after Jianying, we'll hear from Tanya Kanavelli, who's the founder and CEO of the Open Health Network. She's a seasoned entrepreneur, thinker, mentor, advisor, and investor. And she's got a really great diverse set of experiences. She's held senior executive roles at large enterprises and also startups across both healthcare and technology. And then finally, we'll hear from Peter Norvig. And Peter is the Distinguished Education Fellow at Stanford's Human-Centered AI Intelligence Institute. He's also a researcher at Google, where he formerly was the leader of their search algorithms group and research group. He's held many different positions before that, including at NASA Ames, and won many awards. But I think he's really been also a leader in education on artificial intelligence. He literally wrote the book. In fact, his book "AI: A Modern Approach" was where 20+ years ago I first read about and learned AI. So it's really exciting to have him here. Also, I think perhaps maybe most excitingly about him, I don't know if this is still true, but I read that you are the author of the longest palindromic sentence. I don't know if that's still accurate, but impressive nonetheless. So with that, I want to welcome up Jianying, and we'll get this thing started. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Keith, Alondra, and Ida for setting us up so well. Like Keith said, everyone here is an expert. So I'm here to offer a perspective from an AI researcher who has been working in healthcare life sciences space and working very closely with biomedical and clinical researchers as well as practitioners for the last 14 years. So I want to reflect a little bit on what has this experience taught us in terms of how AI technologies, particularly this new wave of AI technologies, can be used to help advance healthcare and precision medicine, and what needs to be done to do it properly. And I am going to end with a few thoughts on explainability, which is a theme of this panel. So AI for healthcare really is all about enabling the journey from data to impact for improved health outcome for all people. As we all know, both the type and the quantity of data has been rapidly increasing. At the same time, the pace of AI advancement has also been increasing very rapidly, right? And as we all have seen, this new wave of AI with foundation models and generative technologies really has a huge impact on the state of the art in AI for medicine. So, with these advances already, we have seen a lot of, in recent years, proof of concept demonstrations of the kind of significant insights and scientific discoveries that can be enabled by AI technologies when AI researchers work closely with domain experts in biomedical and clinical research. So some examples include prognostic and diagnostic biomarkers, deeper understanding of the disease subphenotypes and the heterogeneous progression patterns, and novel insights into disease mechanisms that have led to new hypotheses in potential therapeutic targets as well as drug candidates. Now, with this new wave of AI technologies, it has really changed the AI landscape. Very importantly, from the technology angle, it has dramatically changed. It introduced a new AI workflow. And with that, really significantly expanded the horizons of what's achievable with AI models, right? Because now we know how to train very large models through self-supervised learning on large amount of unlabeled data. And the models that we train, these large models, which are referred to as foundation models, can then be fine-tuned to create many, many task-specific models, but now with much less effort, as well as less requirement on the amount of labeled data that's needed. And as we all know, that's one of the key bottlenecks of scaling AI. So these new technologies really can, dramatically enhance healthcare in two important ways. One is the most important and more immediate way, which is the use of large language models for productivity gain. And that's what a lot of people have been talking about, and we're seeing that happening across industries already. And within healthcare, we can envision many different ways these large language models can enhance productivity, including reduce the paperwork and physician burnout, enhanced interactions between physicians and patient empowerment, and help with difficult diagnosis, as well as more efficient and better monitored clinical trials. Importantly, this is also related to access, because the incredible assistive power of these large language models also has the effect of promoting the democratization of medicine and enhanced access to higher quality care by less privileged people from less developed areas. Now, the second way that these new AI technologies can really bring about advancement in healthcare is by driving discoveries at scale. Now, this is longer term, it requires more research, but we really feel this is a new frontier of AI in healthcare, particularly in driving, enhanced the acceleration of discoveries in understanding of disease mechanisms, and from there, new therapeutics, right? Because now we have the opportunity to really leverage this rich multimodal data that Tony alluded to earlier, that goes far beyond text data, which is what current large language models are about. So data that includes genomics and multiomics, data about disease mechanisms, disease biology, data about medicinal chemistry, as well as different experimental assays. We now have large amount of publicly available data from all of these sources, and we can leverage this data to really train foundation models to learn representations that can capture the complex interactions within the compound and human body complex, which is really at the core of drug discovery, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is still longer term research. A lot more AI advancements are needed before we can achieve this, particularly methods that allows us to learn from additional modalities and cross multiple modalities. But we believe this is doable, and this will not lead to accelerated discovery, but potentially new discoveries that would have not otherwise been possible, right? And this is also particularly important for neglected conditions and populations, because of the potential for these foundation models to transfer learnings from large and more general unlabeled data sets to task-specific models, right? This allows us the ability to make faster progress in these areas while more structural changes are made in addressing these neglected and diseases as well as populations. So, in summary, there is a lot of this new wave of AI really holds great promise, but at the same time, we also need to be extremely careful in managing the risks that could come from these increasingly powerful AI technologies. And I would like to mention 3 key considerations that we should keep in mind as we to manage these risks as we work to harvest the power of AI. The first one is about really policy priorities. That's what Alondra was talking about. And this includes AI, but it goes far beyond AI, right? So the question is, how do you really set up a framework for emerging science, innovation, and technology in such a way that ethical considerations, particularly equity, is really front and center throughout the innovation process instead of it being an afterthought. Again, there are many efforts going on here, and I was part of the committee that Keith co-led on this topic as well, and efforts in this area are extremely important. The second key consideration is to ensure the trustworthiness of AI models by addressing data quality and model quality, and to achieve transparency through really well-designed AI fact sheets and scorecards. And I think some of my fellow panelists will elaborate more on that. And the third key consideration is the importance of explainability. So, there are many different roles that explainability can play in AI for healthcare. For the new wave of AI technologies that I was talking about, there are 2 roles that are particularly important. The first one is explainability allows us to more systematically identify boundary conditions and failure cases. We are all very familiar with those famous examples of the kind of bizarre behavior tools like ChatGPT can have when different people poke at it in different ways. But because we still don't fully understand how these models work, we are far from being able to identify the true boundaries, and that could be dangerous. Even though similar kind of lack of explainability exists for the classical deep learning models, the stake here is much higher because of the extraordinary power of these new type of technologies. And this is also, again, very important for the neglected conditions and populations where the potential for AI models to cause harm is higher because the data density is lower. And then the second very important role for AI explainability to play with this new wave of technology is, as Tony mentioned, this type, explainability can lead to more actionable insights. Right? So for this, it's really important for us to figure out ways to incorporate knowledge into these new AI models by either through the incorporation of knowledge graphs or mechanistic models. This type of explainability for new therapeutic discovery could lead to more precise safety and efficacy profiles, which can in turn lead to more effective safety screening for new therapeutics before we take it to more expensive clinical trials. And then for clinical care, as again, Tony mentioned, this type of explainability can really be the first step of not just identifying risks and instances of AI bias, but actually pointing to possible ways of addressing the risk and reduce the bias. So with that, let me hand it over to my final fellow panelist, Tatiana.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here, and just a little bit of background. I started my company, Open Health Network, 10 years ago, and I started the day or a few days after I was diagnosed with cancer. And at that time, the question was, why me? And at some point of time, when I kind of stopped planning my funeral, I decided to look at all the data that can be used for people like myself in healthcare to find out the reasoning why people get those diseases, what are precision medicine that can be used for me to treat those diseases. And I mapped out all the data sources, including me growing up in Azerbaijan and environmental data and stressors related to some of the things that was happening in my life, all the way to genetics and my all types of data. And that's how I started the company. Without even having all those new developments with generative AI and everything else, I had a vision that once we will get to the point where we'll have access to all the data that can provide invaluable input for algorithms. And at that time I said I would rather be treated by IBM Watson. At that time it was like a big thing than a human being, because I felt it's very difficult for humans to analyze all the amounts of massive data that can be available in the context of healthcare. So out of all the different things that have been mentioned so far, I want to focus on one concept that I'm really thrilled about and passionate about. That's the concept of digital twin. So from my point of view, we should be able at some point of time create data-driven representation of human beings, and considering all the data inputs that I just mentioned and other people have mentioned. And the development of digital twin, data-driven representation of a human being, by the way, the concept of it's new because it has been used in other industries for complex manufacturing devices and so on. But that will enable us to model interventions, precision care, precision therapeutics, and everything else. However, the effectiveness of digital twins is fundamentally anchored in transparency. So we all can relate, we all kind of deal with healthcare. Consider how many of you would be willing to place your health or the health of your loved ones in hands of algorithms that you don't know anything about. And as people were talking, I was just thinking about this thought. And I thought that literally, it was just not in my notes, that we question algorithms and we're trying to get proofs. However, we don't ask probably the same questions when we're treated by humans. Interesting, right? So we also have to look at how we compare in trust levels and how much we put pressure on algorithms versus how much pressure we put, towards a human, and trusting a human physician to give us treatment without just by nature that they've trained physicians. Transparency isn't a bonus, it's a requirement. It ensures ethical deployment and cultivate trust among healthcare providers and patients alike. Transparency gets us in the door, but explainability that keeps us in the room. And as many of you mentioned, and I'm struggling, as many of you, looking forward to discussions on the whole explainability aspect of models. And I think we have to balance the way we can explain something that's very difficult to explain with usability and applicability of things that potentially cannot be explained but might be useful. Explainability, the human touch. In making these algorithms understandable, we essentially humanize them. Clinicians can not only trust the output, but also explain it to patients in a comprehensive manner. This mutual understanding enhances patient satisfaction and adherence to medical advice. So explainability has to be in place, so it's not a technical requirements, but the cornerstones of patient-centered care that we kind of all talked about, human in the middle. And we at Open Health Network think a lot about the context of explainability in the context of like digital twin. We're deploying certain aspects of digital twin right now in underserved communities on the East Coast in the context of sleep studies. And of course, we will have to be able to explain the algorithms that we've built and how they will impact the potential interventions in predictive modeling for certain things in certain types of communities. And again, I think it's an open discussions that we'll have throughout the day. Call to action. As we collectively strive to improve healthcare through advanced technologies, let's not lose the sight of humans behind the data points. Transparency and explainability are more than just ethical imperatives. They are vital cogs in the world of medical innovation. To paraphrase a well-known saying, with great algorithmic power comes great responsibility. It's up to us, technologists, healthcare providers, policymakers, to ensure that we wield the power, not just engineering, but with integrity. Thank you for your attention, and I'm just looking forward to the full day of wonderful discussions. Thank you.
Hi, great to be here. I have no medical training or expertise, so I'm the least expert person in the room on that front. But I am an AI hipster. I was doing it before it was cool. Now, we've heard a lot of words today of sort of overlapping ideas, right? So we have algorithmic justice, we have responsible AI, safe AI, trustworthy AI, trusted AI ethics, transparency, human-centered AI. I think these are all getting at overlapping problems. I really like algorithmic justice, so I'm glad you guys chose that term, and I'm happy to be here. And of the other ones, I guess I like responsible AI and human-centered AI, because I think they put the emphasis in the right place. I think we should be responsible in the way we build these things, and we should build them for, of, and by the people. And some of the other ones seems like it's kind of pushing aside where the responsibility is, and mentioned that earlier about trustworthiness. Now, so I've been at Google for over 20 years. I think the company was kind of built on this idea that we were going to deal with large data, and data is an asset. But it took us a couple of years to realize that data can also be a liability, and that we have a responsibility as a good shepherd for users' data. And sometimes that means it's better not to have it at all, to say it would be too dangerous to have this data because some attack may get at it, or even if we kept it perfectly safe, just the impression that we might be doing something wrong with it could be negative. And that kind of changed the way we thought about things. I think another change was recognizing that we're not just passive observers, that we're also part of a sort of game theoretic interaction, and that when we build something, the world changes, and therefore the data that's coming out, it changes. And there's this kind of cycle that you have to keep up with. And if you just build one static system, then you're going to fall behind. Then another big lesson for me was saying, you know, as mentioned, I wrote this big, thick textbook that's got all sorts of algorithms in it, but I think those aren't really the key thing, right? So we went from saying first, you know, so Rob mentioned reading the, I guess, the 1995 edition, when we talked about, well, AI is part of computer science is about algorithms, so we're going to show you a bunch of cool algorithms. Later editions, we said, well, now we're in this era of big data. So yeah, we still got algorithms in the book, but if you had to do better, maybe you'd be better off getting better data rather than getting better algorithms. In this latest edition, I think our point of view is more like, well, everybody can get the algorithms and the data. You can download them from GitHub. What's really hard is deciding what is it that you're trying to optimize. We have these cool algorithms that can work on data and can come up with an answer, but what's the right thing to optimize? What's fair across all groups? What allocates the harm and the benefits properly? And that's something that in earlier days, we just said, oh, well, you know, don't worry about that. Your job as an engineer is to get the highest possible score, and your boss or your professor is going to tell you what to optimize, and you just go out and do that. Now I say, that's really the hardest part. And training the whole workforce to be aware of that is where the advances are going to be made. So yeah, you know, I still enjoy reading a new paper with a cool new algorithm and so on, but that's not going to change the world as much as educating everyone to understand how to go forward and how to build these systems safely and reliably. Now, we were talking beforehand about trying to say something controversial, and so far, I think we're all agreeing a little bit too much. So I want to take a stand, and I would want to say, don't depend too much on explainability. So yes, having an explanation is better than not having an explanation. But an explanation is just a story, and the stories don't always tell the whole truth. So you may notice that every day the stock market goes up or down, and there's a so-called expert, and they've got an explanation. But I'm pretty sure that if it had gone the other way, they would have had a completely different explanation, right? So how much can we trust them? They tell part of the story, but they don't tell the whole story. So I would like to think of actually solving the problem and then explaining it as two separate tasks. And don't think that you have to do both of them at the same time. So get the best solution you can, and then separately get the best explanation or the best sort of interaction to understand what's going on. You know, Einstein allegedly said something like, make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think sometimes we're dealing with problems that are just complex, and trying to make them simple doesn't do justice to them. So we say, oh, well, neural nets are not very transparent because they got all these billions of parameters. We can't understand what they're doing. Something like a decision tree is more transparent because you can look at it and it says if A and B and C, then X, and everyone can understand that. The problem is that works most of the time, and then you come across a case where A, B, and C are true, but X is not the right answer. And then you say, oh, well, of course, what I meant was A, B, and C, but not D. It goes without saying that this rule doesn't apply when D is the case, right? So these explanations are flawed and incomplete. Okay. And then I guess this also goes into how we want to deal with legislation. That's a completely separate story. But I know in the European Union, one of the important things they did was come up with a right to explanation. And I think in many cases that's good, but it's incomplete. And I think they didn't quite get the legislation right. And I think that's a problem throughout. I'm glad that people like Dr. Nelson are here and are knowledgeable and trying to push us towards making better decisions, but sometimes decisions get rushed. and the legislation isn't quite right. So in the EU, they enacted the right to explanation. Then they had to write another law that said it's okay to have anti-lock brakes on cars because they make autonomous decisions and they can't explain themselves, but they save lives anyway, so it's going to be okay to have them. So if you have to write that as a separate law, probably you got the first law wrong. And hopefully all its experts can come together and help government come up with better approaches to getting that right in the first place. So I'm in the Center for Human-Centered AI at Stanford. What does that mean? I think we focus on a couple of things. One is the early engagement of multidisciplinary teams, saying this is not just a technological problem of somebody's going to write some code. This is a problem of building a system that people are going to live in. And so you want to bring all the stakeholders into it right at the beginning. So don't design a system just for the users, also design it for the rest of the stakeholders and for society as a whole. So you're building a self-driving car. Yeah, you want to have a nice display on the screen for the person in the car and you want a nice smooth ride, but you also worry about, well, who are the other stakeholders? Well, it's the pedestrians and the other cars. If you haven't solved for them, you haven't solved the problem. What's the effect on society? How is this going to affect traffic patterns? How is it going to affect sprawl of urban to suburbs? How is it going to affect unemployment of taxi drivers and so on? So we want to look at all of those levels. And I think that's important. When we can do that, we get a better alignment of our social issues with the systems we build. And I think that's what we're all trying for. So I guess now it's time for questions.
To ask all of the speakers and Dr. Nelson as well, please come up and take a seat. And we will have a panel up here where we take questions from the audience. Well, welcome and thank you all again for sharing your experiences and perspectives with us. I think to get things started, I would like to reflect on a theme that came up in many of your presentations, but most notably here in Peter's at the end, that transparency means very different things to different stakeholders. Me as someone who's trained in computer science cares about what were the inputs, what were the weights that were learned by the algorithm, whereas someone that is more of a clinician probably cares about how do those predictions interact with existing guidelines and their understanding of the nature of disease. The patient cares a lot about, well, how is my data being used to make this prediction? And then social scientists will care about larger scale societal effects. And I think we agree that we need to have consideration of all of those effects, but how practically can we as an institution, as a sort of medical center, bring those different perspectives to bear on any given issue, any given algorithm? Because I think they will be quite specific to the application of the algorithm. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts on the practical ways to implement these different visions of transparency and approach that. I didn't start with a softball, I apologize.
I would just take a first cut from patient point of view. I always had issues with companies making money based on my eyeballs, right? They're making money, I'm not, right? So I think it's a valid kind of question, how much consent you need to have from a patient before you monetize, whether it's an algorithm or anything else. And of course, there's a flip side that if we don't have enough data, then we can't develop good algorithms. So can we simplify concerns and enable patients to make a choice if my data is used for research, but not for monetization? I'm okay with that. And I think all those questions should be on the table unless, want to have some kind of injustice in terms of how patients' data are used. So I'm just talking from that angle. Yep.
All right, so maybe I'll add to that. First of all, I think it's absolutely correct that what Ida said before, this is all a conversation, right? Trustworthiness and explainability is a two-way street. It's always in the context of interaction. But that said, from the technology angle, in terms of answering your question of how to enable the implementation of these very complex concepts of explainability of many different types, transparency of many different types. I think one thing that we can do in the technical community is to really, again, work with all the stakeholders, but really foster this idea of open science, open science communities. So it's kind of building on the concept of open source software, right? So open source software really changed the way software have been developed, in the sense that people now build on projects that are managed by a community of developers, so you don't end up repeating efforts, and you have a community that's very much aware of all the available tools out there. So similarly, I think we should really think about building this open science community of, you know, all the explainability, AI explainability algorithms out there, all the AI fact sheets and scorecards and best practices, so that everyone who's interested in building a explainable system can have this set of tools to support that conversation and implementation.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to follow up on that topic specifically with this group. How essential is it, in your views, that the full stack of algorithms and tools being applied be open source? You know, ChatGPT, we could build something on top of that, but it's not ultimately going to be open source or accessible to most of the users. Is that a problem?
So I think it cuts both ways. So by making some things open source, you get more eyeballs on it. You can protect against a certain kind of errors there, and that's proven a good model. So if your threat model is, I'm worried about some malware being in my software, then making it open source is a good idea. On the other hand, having a service that's behind a firewall and all the queries to it are logged gives you another type of protection, right? And so I think with these large language models, it's more of a danger to say, well, what are the bad guys trying to do? Are they trying to build a pathogen that can kill everybody? And if you're monitoring all their inputs that come in to a large language model, you have some chance of detecting that. If you open source it, then they have their own copy. Now you've lost that. So that there's a trade-off. It cuts both ways.
So I would agree with that. I would also say that part of what we're trying to accomplish, I think, with open source is different from, I think, the kind of open science, open source software world that many of us sort of grew up in, speaking for those of my age or around my age. And I think what we're trying to accomplish now also has added public accountability to it. And that was not what we were trying to do 25 years ago in open science. And so to go to your question about transparency and link these things together, it's also the case that what people are asking for. So I think we cannot get caught up on definitions and subfield expertise definitions about transparency. This is actually a sort of political request that's being made, right? And so it is certainly both about what's technically possible or not possible, but it's also about a larger community of stakeholders. The concentric circle has gotten much bigger than our small research communities, demanding access to information about the tools and systems in their lives. And so I think for a research institution, one of the finest in the world, for a public institution, that there should be a higher bar. I mean, that we should sort of, coming from an institution also, the Institute for Advanced Study, where people work on really hard problems. It was the place where Einstein was on the faculty. People go there to work on problems that we say like, oh, we're never going to solve that. We can't lose, I think, that mission. And I don't want the explainability as an engineering problem to get lost in the larger world of explainability as a basic science problem. And I think that we need to sort of be clear about those two things. And so I think there are incentives to ship product before you can explain it. And then I think there are different incentives in research communities that are distinctly research communities and not application communities also that are different. And so I don't want to give up on, I sort of understand that there's all sorts of things we can't explain. I mean, even in social science, I mean, we run, you can't explain most of things in the world, right? And so, you don't, so I agree with, you raise this point, you raise this point. We don't want to over index on explainability, but we also can do a lot better job than we're currently doing. And part of that responsibility lies with basic research communities and with public institutions like UCSF.
Thank you. I think even though I have 47 more questions, I want to open it up to the audience. Yes. They'll come down to you.
Oh, yeah.
Here, no, I'll bring it.
I'm Leticia Marquez Magaña. I'm the Health and Equity Research Professor at San Francisco State, which is a minority serving institution. So I interact regularly with historically neglected students. And so my question is around the idea that Peter talked about is human-centered. And in fact, this explainability, human-centered, I'm thinking, is the user, is the patient, is the community. Nonetheless, what I'm hearing is the focus on the developer, the scientist, to explain in a way that's understandable to those individuals. And so the 5E model by Bybee about health literacy does not focus on explaining the professor end, but that the students understand, or the trainees, the learners, understand and can explain to one another what they've understood. Okay, so it's not about the transmission of knowledge, but the fact that they get the knowledge and then they can explain it to one another is a way to monitor whether this is happening. The reason this is important to me is that folks talked about cells and the ion channels and that sort of thing. If you go on campus at San Francisco State and you talk about cells, they're thinking about prison cells. If you talk about trials, they're not talking about clinical trials. Probation, which is academic. There's all these words that we use that confuse individuals. And so at the very basic level, how do we engineer that it's not about the transmission of knowledge, but the creation of knowledge and the use of language that is not prohibitive to that? So for example, this is the last part, Rebecca Skloot was here for Ground Rounds, and she talked about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. And scientist explains to her family members, where their cells were monetized, what was going on. And she reported that her daughter thought that Henrietta was in a cell somewhere, right? So how do you overcome that misunderstanding? I mean, so I wanted to flip it a little bit. Is it explainability in terms of how we as individuals who have been trained explain it to others, or how those individuals take that information and use it in a way to make decisions that are appropriate to them and their families?
So I'll jump in. I thought she was addressing it to Professor Norvig. I would go back to what I said at the beginning, that we confuse explainability with what's being asked, and people want accountability and information about what's happening. And so the Deborah Lacks example, I think, is an interesting one, because she's, I think that moment in Rebecca's book in which, she sort of wants to hold this file, that she, sort of holds her mother, is both an understanding and a misunderstanding. And so I think it's hard to sort of port that to the space of AI, but I think what people can offer who are not sort of domain experts is how the use cases matter for them. And what people are asking is, I want to have access to healthcare that is, safe and fair and helps my family, be healthier and the like. And I want to understand how it's happening. And so the explainability, if we confuse it with just a technical definition of explainability, is not getting to the piece that you understand. On the sort of peer-to-peer learning as a teacher, I fundamentally sort of get what you're saying there, but I also think that that people need to have a fundamental understanding of a decision tree. And I actually don't think it's that, but I think it can be done. I mean, my first book that Keith mentioned was about Black communities in the Bay Area being early adopters of genetic science and direct to community-based genetic counseling and screening. So there's a way that can happen, but I also think that we should hold up still the ability for that there's sort of understanding of the technology at a certain level, whatever that level is, and is part of that peer-to-peer network.
Yeah, I guess I would say I thought your comments were great, and I think they point out the need for communication. And sometimes maybe the medical profession isn't the best at that. They've got all this jargon. They tend to use that. So it's not really an AI question. It's just how do you serve your patients and your community at their level? And I think that comes through training. Maybe it comes through teamwork. That if the doctor isn't good at doing that kind of communication, then maybe there's a social worker or an aide or somebody else who's going to be better at getting that done. But kind of focusing on making sure that the communication happens, I think is great. I love your idea of kind of the peer-to-peer learning. We've seen that a lot in the online classes that we've done. So, I put together a class, and at first I thought, my job is just information. If I say things clearly, then I'm done. And I realized, no, that's only a small part of it. The most important part turned out to be motivation. That are the students going to come back tomorrow and want to learn more? And that's not because the explanation was clear. That's because we set up the whole environment. And part of that was peer-to-peer. Part of it was forming groups that they could feel that they're a part of. So setting up that whole environment seems more important than just the words that you use.
And I just want to add that I'm working with a lot of patients, and we mentioned those with like rare diseases. And in some cases, it's easier for them and explain to them how to use certain generative AI tools to get everything that they need to know in the context of very complex set of symptoms and everything that they experience than getting it from peers or even from the physician provider. And I think this new technology, generative AI, will enable more people to get more personalized contextual help that they can get either from peers or from even teachers. If we will train all of us on how to properly use different types of generative AI tools, because they all have different properties. And I think it's our responsibility to educate, because what we're experiencing right now with those new technologies we never experienced before. This is completely new game. And it's our responsibility to educate like every single person within the ecosystem on how to use those tools for the benefits of.
Can I just say one thing I think is important to say in a healthcare setting, that these tools are not reliable, the large language models, that they hallucinate quite a lot, and there's evidence of people getting inaccurate healthcare information. And it's also the case that if you were using the kind of free versions of them, they are ingesting your information into their data set. And so you cannot put sensitive data in them. And so I think people should play with them, should learn how to use them, should, the sort of prompting, them differently to get you get all sorts of different inputs. They're like fun tools. But in a healthcare setting, I think that we just need to be saying publicly that there's the caution that should be raised as well.
That's a controversy here. That's what we're looking for, discussions. So I agree with you. That's why I use verb education. When you educate people, you tell them, yes, model hallucinate. And I can give you gazillions examples where it's 100% of hallucinations. So as long as we understand limitations, but at the same time, we need to educate on how to use them. So total agreement.
I just want to follow up a little bit back on the explainability from what angle and this example of decision tree versus that works. Well, yes, it's true. There are certain problems that just cannot be solved by decision trees. That's simple, that's explainable. But for the complex models that's needed, neural networks and now the large language models and foundation models and generative AI in general, there has also been a lot of progress made in terms of this notion of ad hoc explainability, meaning after you build the model, you come in to interrogate it and build other auxiliary analytics models to explain what the model is producing. And a lot of that actually is in terms of what these models, explainable models do, has taken into consideration input from a lot of users, not just the AI developers. For example, this type of explainability that's based on contrastive explanation, meaning providing pertinent positive examples versus pertinent negative examples and use that to explain. And there are also other explainability tools like prototype, meaning where it pulls samples from the underlying distribution to explain why the model is doing what it's doing. So there is a lot of effort going into how to explain it in a way that satisfies more the question coming from the user's angle versus the developer's angle.
Can I say an interesting example of that is at DeepMind, they built the Go and chess playing programs. And the first versions were built with the help of experts, players of the game, to sort of push it along. Then they said, I think we can do it without that. We'll have no experts whatsoever. We'll learn just from self-play. And that version did it even better. And now they've rehired the experts to say, can you come in and explain what these systems are doing, right? To say, here's a move that it suggests, a chess move that goes against all the teaching of chess. We believe it's the right move, but can you explain it in a way that humans can now understand how the world has changed? And it takes an expert to understand that and be able to say, this is what it's doing, not just in this one move, but here's the general approach that it came up with.
Thank you. More questions? I think we had one in the back. We also have several questions online. Great. Let's take an online question.
So this can be to anyone. This is from an anonymous questioner, and that is, we talk about the possibility of AI to create more equitable access to medicine. Do we actually have examples of that happening?
There were some examples, I believe, where I think it was published where the woman had some kind of, I think her child had some kind of disease, and the child was in care by many different specialists for many years. And then she input all the data into generative AI, and generative AI was able to generate hypotheses of diagnosis that happen to be correct. So there are both sides, like you mentioned, hallucinations, but there are published use cases where it was of help. And I'm working with a patient that has rare disease, highly complex. And we sat down, and it's a matter of educating how she can feed the sequence of all the different tests and her experiences to help generate hypotheses. Of course, I mean, she will run it by all the healthcare experts, but at least it might speed up the process of diagnosis. But I think this type of tools will be used and are used by patients to democratize access, especially in communities where there is very limited access to specialists.
More questions?
Hi. It it seems a little naive that we haven't talked about insurance and profits yet, because the problem is in a capitalist society is that the person who makes the best AI that's going to create the most profits for your industry is going to become the leader. And that leader could be SBF with the back door, and that leader could not be. And unfortunately, as we all know now, we might not know if there's a back door or not, because we're not all individual experts at all these individual things that have so much power against us. So what are we doing to, I don't even know. That I think that's the scary part. What are we doing? I mean, because we can already see that not always the best people step up to take the best jobs.
Yeah. Well, you didn't introduce yourself. Kate, Vice Chancellor Yamamoto said you were supposed to. Thank you for that. To tie it back to the anonymous health equity question, I mean, I think the market incentives are misaligned, right? And so there's a really critical role for government to play here, and I've been actually quite struck by how speculative some of the sort of utopian things about AI are as the dystopian, right? Like robots are going to kill us. We're going to solve all disease and live forever. And, you know, in each of those cases, the challenges that we face is getting to a level of granularity that you can like actually operationalize and do something about it. And I think, you know, there's critique of the like robots are going to kill us and like, it's all, you know, who's modeling it and all of that. You can make the same critique on the side of like, we're going to cure cancer with AI. Like we have got to get to a level of practice and granularity with that claim. And we're not there yet. And so I think to your point about the market and about capitalism, that, you know, models like, I don't know if you've been tracking in particular things like ARPA-H, which, you know, has an equity mandate as part of its work. It is early days there. I hope it succeeds wildly. It may not. You know, the ARPA model has not been used before as a model that has equity built in upstream from the beginning. So let's see. But to do healthcare at scale for equity, you know, we've got to make it the case. And to your point about the companies, like that's the incentive structure is not quite there unless there are partnerships with government.
Yeah, and building on that, we regulate many industries to protect consumers. What is the right is there a right model in the existing ways we regulate industries, or do we need a totally new one for this kind of application? And I agree with you that ARPA-H is great, but it's not going to be sufficient for us to protect, you know, patients against all the sorts of concerns that I think are rightfully raised.
And I guess one issue is, you know, you mentioned insurance, and as these systems get better at predicting, the insurance industry may disappear because, you know, the system will say, you're going to have $24,000 worth of medical care in this coming year, so that's your premium. And you say, well, I might as well just pay it myself rather than have insurance. So this, I think, you know, we've come to this weird situation in the U.S. where we have
the death of insurance. Another thing that AI is going to give us.
Wait.
Where, you know, we've kind of pooled the risk due to ignorance of who's going to cause a problem. And if that ignorance goes away, then that pooling strategy no longer works. And maybe we'll be forced to go to public health care or some other model.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation. Peter, I want to pick up on a point that you made where you I think, kind of made the point of value versus harm. And even if you can't explain how you get there, that's the critical decision making. How do you measure or predict harm before it happens? Or is there, and I'm not familiar with the scorecards that you were talking about, but is there a methodology to make that value versus harm decision before it's released, and then you find out about the harm later?
Yeah, so you do a lot of testing up front, and it's easy to deal with the kind of the the smaller cases of, I make this prediction, it's right or wrong. Is this the better drug or is that? And you can get some kind of a model of how well I'm going to do on that, and what are the harms of a false positive or a false negative. And then you have to track that over time because the world changes, right? And we've kind of built these systems on a lie, right? So if you look at the statistical foundations of all of machine learning, it says, well, these predictions only hold if the future is the same as the past, if they're all individually IID. And that's never true. The world always changes. So you have to continually monitor that. And I think, going back 5 years as an industry, we were not very good at that. I think people are now recognizing that continual monitoring and testing up front is really important. And so for these day-to-day decisions, I think we're better at that. The other risk we have to deal with is this catastrophic societal risk. Are Terminator robots going to take over the world? Or is somebody going to invent a pathogen and either accidentally or intentionally release it from the lab and kill everyone? Those are much harder to predict, right? We don't know whether that's a 1 in a billion, a 1 in a trillion. It's hard to make those kinds of judgments. And I don't have an answer for how to make that better.
So I'll just add to that.
I just want to know, we're having such a great discussion. We're getting so many great questions coming in. We're going to add 5 minutes.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on that with a sort of a specific example in medicine, which, this question of whether explainability is absolutely needed before you push something out, which is true, it's not always needed, but I think having explainability will allow us to do much better. So, a lot of people say all the existing medicines that has been approved, for most of them, we don't know the mechanism of action, which is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best way of doing things. The fact that we don't know the mechanism of action contributes to, on the one hand, unintended harm. That's why we put so much effort in post-market safety surveillance. On the other hand, a lot of missed opportunities of additional benefits. And that's why we have so much ad hoc efforts now in drug repurposing to understand, out of this existing drugs, what other benefits are there? Now, if we had gone in with better understanding of mechanisms, we'll be a lot more efficient and we'll be able to reduce a lot more unintended harm while benefit more from these additional mechanisms of action.
Yeah. Should we go back to Zoom? Are there questions?
Let me just jump in for 30 seconds if I can. So I agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. Understanding the mechanisms is really important. But just to propagate the controversy, one other issue I have with explanations is that sometimes my case is not what I want to look at, right? So say I apply for a loan from the bank, I get turned down. I say, I demand an explanation. And they say, well, you didn't have enough collateral or something like that. Now, maybe that explanation is right, or maybe they're biased against me for my race or religion or something. But I can't know that from that one explanation. I can only know if they're biased by saying, give me your statistics over everybody who applied and who got accepted and turned down. So explanation is one tool, and this kind of statistic analysis is a complementary tool.
Yeah, so I think the bottom line is it's not just explanations, but the right kind of explanations. for the specific use case, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a person on Zoom who is asking the question about computer scientists and people actually developing algorithms. And you all have noted that oftentimes they themselves don't understand exactly how their outputs are being generated or what the algorithm is specifically doing that's creating these accurate predictions. And that there's a new field of study that actually is aiming to understand that more on the fundamental level. So this person is essentially asking, are you aware of any efforts to ensure that equity is part of that new field, that process of understanding algorithms, essentially?
I guess to me, the key for that, as with other aspects, is to have these multidisciplinary teams from the start. Right? To have, yes, you want the computer scientists coming up with the algorithms, but you also want the ethnographers and the sociologists and so on, and you want people representing different groups to make sure that all those voices are heard from.
I think the data part, right? So we need not just, like you mentioned, have initial point of having representative data sets, but have consistent way of monitoring over time if the equity, the dynamic based on who is providing data change, because a lot of people, for example, are excluded from healthcare, so their data is not there. So how you can monitor, take or maybe synthesize data sets that can represent them, it's an issue.
So I'm glad that resources are being put into researchers working on some of these questions, but you know, the framing of it being a new field, and I know that's how we're talking about it, is a little ridiculous, right? I mean, you know, what the new field is verifiable science. It's science, you know. So we're like we're having to create a new field because we've been shipping product that has not been proven to be safe and effective, which is the first principle of the AI Bill of Rights, right? And so what the new field is effectively the old field, which is science that can be tested and peer reviewed, you know, and you know, I'm not going to sort of you know, sort of hold aloft the banner for peer review, or you know, like there's all sorts of challenges in the science ecosystem and the research ecosystem that we need to fix. But let's not act like the new field is not just trying to like replicate the thing that we should have been doing from the beginning with some of these systems.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, right? So in other fields, like in civil engineering, we don't have one field of building bridges and a separate field for building bridges that don't fall down.
Exactly.
One more question. So we've already got Mike over here. Let's get you there.
Hi, my name is Kate. I've been a patient at UCSF since I was 13, and I also sit on the Patient Advisory Council. So that's kind of the hat that I'm wearing today. I am in kind of a group of rare patients that I've been told by providers all over the country that they don't know. And that's across lots of different specialties. And so I and a few of friends I've made through the internet and social media, we are so desperate for any kind of answer that I think the idea of something that is like, oh, we don't know if that is a safe way of sharing your information. Like, I don't care. I want to know what is wrong with me. And I think that like nobody has been able to provide answers. And there are so many patients that, someone mentioned being excluded from data sets. And there are a lot of us that, like there was a clinical trial I was submitting to be part of, and they said like, oh, but you have too many comorbidities and there are too many other factors at play here. So we can't include you in this. So there are a group of us that just have so many different things going on that no singular person or group is able to have theories about everything. And so like the idea of AI getting involved, like maybe then they can figure it out because science hasn't been able to yet. Everyone in here can know my genome if they would like to, if someone can tell me what is going on. There's not really a question in there, but I would love thoughts.
Well, no, thank you so much for sharing that, because it is underscores so powerfully the fact that patients are not just, they're the numbers that come out of some test. They have a set of very relevant preferences about, their healthcare and how it proceeds. And I think that's far too often ignored in the development of these algorithms and certainly the implementation of these algorithms. So I think it's absolutely should be at the forefront of what we think about as inputs.
Yeah, and I think I didn't mention that for patients, it's just within healthcare, there are certain challenges, and I think one of them that I observed is we have lots of very knowledgeable specialists, and when you have a complex comorbidities, it's very hard to coordinate with all the massive things among, you know, tons of different people. So in some cases, if you can start kind of systematically feeding all the test results, all your personal experiences, like patient reported, into some AI engines, they can potentially generate certain hypotheses that intersect, but at the same time, you know, the knowledge base for those AI engines comes from, you know, a variety of different research. However, in this complex cases, and I'm working with some patients that have that complexity, the hallucinations by generative AIs actually can be a good thing because they can generate potential hypotheses that's not obviously come from a specific condition. So I would look at this as a tool to complement the things that you're getting from healthcare.
The organizers have already been very generous in giving us extra time. We will be around after this session and throughout the day. So please, if you had questions that we didn't get to, reach out to panel members and each other. So I'd like to thank all of you, thank our panelists for really a wonderful discussion. And Angela, you'll give the information for the survey?
Yes.